I was never one to believe in ghosts or hauntings, but there was something about that coffee shop on Maple Street that defied my logic. It was an old, quaint building wedged between a modern bookshop and a faded laundromat, its sign swinging gently as if caught in a perpetual breeze. Brood Awakenings, it read, the paint chipped and faded like a whispered secret. It was a Thursday afternoon when I first stepped inside. The smell of ground coffee beans hit me like a warm hug, and the soft murmur of hushed conversations acted as a subtle soundtrack. I ordered a simple black coffee and took a seat by the window. The barista, a middle-aged woman with piercing blue eyes and a somber smile, handed me my drink with a whispered, "Enjoy, but be careful." Her words were odd, but I brushed them off, attributing them to quirky local charm. I settled into my seat, the cushion slightly too firm, and watched as people passed by outside. That's when I first felt it, an inexplicable chill that seemed to seep from the very walls of the building. I shrugged off my jacket, assuming it was just a draft, but the chill persisted. As I sat there, trying to focus on my book, the lights flickered. Once, twice, a subtle threat. The other patrons didn't seem to notice, their eyes glued to laptops or lost behind the pages of books. I tried to ignore it, but then the whispers started. At first, they were indistinct, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But slowly, they grew louder, more insistent. "Leave," they hissed, a serpentine suggestion that slithered around my thoughts. I looked around, my heart pounding in my chest, but everyone else remained undisturbed. "Did you hear that?" I asked the woman at the next table, my voice barely a whisper. She looked up, her face pale, her eyes wide with unspoken fear. "Hear what?" she replied, but her voice trembled, belying her calm exterior. I turned back to my coffee, the black liquid suddenly unappealing. The whispers grew louder, angry now. "Leave now," they demanded. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the old wooden floor. The sound seemed to break a spell, and suddenly, everyone was looking at me, their faces distorted with expressions I couldn't quite place, fear, perhaps, or maybe warning. As I walked to the door, the temperature dropped further, and my breath fogged in the air. The door seemed miles away, each step heavier than the last. The whispers turned to shouts, bouncing around the walls like a physical force. "Go!" I reached for the door, my hands shaking, when a scream pierced the air. It was loud, visceral, and coming from the back room. The barista, the same one who'd served me, was backing away from the hallway that led to the bathrooms, her face a mask of terror. "There's something there," she screamed, pointing to the darkness beyond. "It's here." The room went silent, everyone frozen in place. I felt drawn to the hallway, an inexplicable pull towards whatever horror lay in wait. With a determination I didn't know I possessed, I moved towards it, the temperature dropping with each step until I could see my breath cloud in front of me in thick, frosty puffs. The light at the end of the hallway flickered violently as I approached, the bulb buzzing like an angry wasp. And then I saw it, a shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, shifting unnaturally. It had no definite shape, a swirling mass of blackness, but it exuded malevolence, a pure, undiluted hatred that was almost palpable. I stopped, my body refusing to move any closer. The shadow grew larger, stretching towards me like fingers of a hand reaching for my soul. "Get out," it roared, a sound so forceful it vibrated through my bones. I ran. I ran as fast as I could, out of the coffee shop, out into the sunlight, gasping for breath, my heart racing. Behind me, the door slammed shut with a force that echoed down the street. I never went back to Brood Awakenings, but the memory of that day haunted me. Nights were the worst, when the darkness seemed to press against my windows, whispering threats in the same hissing tones I'd heard in the coffee shop. Months passed, and I tried to forget, to convince myself it had been a hallucination, a trick of the light, anything but what my gut told me it was. But Maple Street called to me, a siren song that I couldn't ignore. One day, I found myself standing in front of the coffee shop again. It looked different, darker, somehow, as if it had succumbed to some internal rot. The sign was gone, replaced by a simple, hand-painted board that read closed. I stood there, staring at the building, feeling the chill seep from the walls, watching as the shadows played across the closed curtains. And I knew, with a certainty that sunk into my bones, that whatever resided in Brood Awakenings was waiting, biding its time. And I knew, too, that one day, I would have to face it again. Time drifted like a forgotten melody, but the grip of what lay within Brood Awakenings never loosened. Night after night, the darkness pulled in the corners of my room, whispering, creeping closer with each passing hour until the first rays of dawn scattered them like cockroaches. The shadow that haunted the coffee shop seemed to have stitched itself into the fabric of my existence, its dark tendrils seeping through the cracks of my reality. One evening, drawn by a force I couldn't resist, I found myself walking back to Maple Street. The street was unusually deserted, the other shops dark, their windows like blind eyes turned inward, refusing to witness the night's eerie calm. Brood Awakenings stood at the far end, its facade more decrepit than I remembered, the paint peeling like scabs from a wound. The closed sign hung crookedly, swaying slightly as if touched by an unfelt breeze. I pushed open the door, the familiar creak echoing too loudly in the silent street. The smell of stale coffee still lingered, mixed now with something else, something foul, like decay. The interior was shrouded in darkness. As I stepped inside, my eyes slowly adjusted, and I could make out the faint outlines of chairs upturned on tables and the counter silhouetted against the faint moonlight filtering through the grimy windows. The air was cold, colder than it should have been, and it carried a slight tremor, as if the building itself was shivering. I moved further in, my footsteps muted on the dusty floor. The whispers started again, soft and insidious, slithering around the edges of my consciousness. "Why did you come back?" they hissed, their voices laced with malevolence. I didn't have an answer. As I reached the counter, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath fogged in front of me, and I saw frost creeping over the wooden surface of the counter. Then, the shadows began to coalesce. At first, they were just darker patches of darkness, but slowly, terrifyingly, they took form. A figure emerged from the blackness, tall and thin, its features blurred, but its eyes, those eyes were clear, bright, and utterly malevolent. They burned with a cold fire, locking onto mine, paralyzing me. The figure moved closer, the air around it swirling with the chill of the grave. "You should not have returned," it whispered, the voice echoing in my mind, a direct communication that filled me with an ice-cold dread. The walls seemed to bend inward, the shadows stretching towards me like clawed hands. More figures appeared, each emerging from the shadow, their forms vague and shifting, but all with the same blazing eyes. They surrounded me, a circle of darkness, their whispers growing louder, drowning out all other sounds. "You belong to us now," they murmured. "You stepped into our world." Their faces began to change, morphing into grotesque masks of terror, mouths gaping, eyes bulging. The air was thick with the stench of rotting earth. I tried to move, to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot, as if the shadows had grown over them. Just then, a scream shattered the eerie chorus. It was a raw, tortured sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The figures recoiled, their forms wavering, and for a moment, the oppressive atmosphere lifted, a brief respite that gave me a sliver of strength. I turned and ran towards the door, the figures howling in rage behind me. Their cold hands brushed against my skin, their touch like the caress of death. I burst out into the street, the door slamming shut behind me with a force that sent a shockwave through the night. Gasping for breath, I looked back. The shop was silent, dark, attuned once more. But I knew it was only a matter of time before it called to me again, its whispers curling around my thoughts, a persistent echo in the darkness of my mind. As I walked away, the chill didn't leave me. It clung to my skin, a permanent shroud that whispered of return, of unfinished business, and of a darkness that awaited with open arms. I knew I would be back, drawn by the same morbid curiosity and unexplainable pull that had led me here tonight. The streetlights flickered as I passed, shadows dancing at the edge of my vision, always just out of sight but never out of mind. The night had grown deeper, the darkness more complete, as if brute awakenings cast a pall over the world around it, a blackness that the light couldn't pierce. Somewhere, an owl hooted, a mournful sound that seemed like a warning. The wind picked up, whispering through the trees, carrying voices that weren't there, calling my name in a chorus of the damned. I walked faster, my heart pounding in my chest, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with every step. The darkness pressed close, tangible, as if it could swallow me whole. And somewhere, just beyond the veil of night, the shadows waited, patient and hungry. As I reached my home, the door creaking open, the safety of light seemed a fragile shield against the dark horrors I had left behind. But I knew, deep down, that light was just a temporary comfort. The true darkness was inside me now, a seed planted in that cursed ground, waiting to grow. And outside, the night was still, too still, as if holding its breath. Waiting. Watching. Ready for when the darkness called me back to brute awakenings. The stillness of the night settled around me like a cloak, heavy with unspoken threats. As I locked the door behind me, the familiar confines of my home felt strangely alien, as if the darkness had followed me, seeping into the walls and corners, a specter unwilling to be left behind. Days passed, each more oppressive than the last. My nights were haunted by vivid nightmares where I wandered through endless, dark corridors of brute awakenings, pursued by the whispering shadows. Each morning, I awoke feeling less rested, my mind foggy, my thoughts continually drifting back to the coffee shop. It was as if the building itself had cast a spell upon me, binding me to its dark heart. Driven by a desperate need to understand, I began researching the history of brute awakenings. My quest led me to the local library, where ancient newspapers and town records spoke of the building's dark past. It had been many things before it became a coffee shop, a bookstore, a barber shop, and, most disturbingly, a funeral home in the early 1900s. The article detailed various unexplained incidents, shadows that moved against the laws of light and physics, cold spots that appeared suddenly, and an overwhelming sense of dread that settled over anyone who spent too long inside. As I dug deeper, I uncovered a story about the original owner, a man named Edward Malley, who was rumored to have been involved in occult practices. His sudden, unexplained death had been the subject of much local speculation. Some believed he had summoned something he couldn't control, something that eventually consumed him. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly fitting together, forming a picture that was as terrifying as it was fascinating. Whatever Edward had summoned, it seemed it had never left the building. It lingered, hungry and waiting. Armed with this knowledge, I felt a strange resolve settle over me. I needed to face the darkness once more, to confront whatever haunted the halls of Brood Awakenings. Perhaps I could find a way to end it, to banish the shadows back to wherever they had come from. On a night when the moon was just a thin crescent in the sky, casting minimal light over the slumbering town, I returned to the coffee shop. The air was crisp, the wind carrying a hint of winter's chill. The building loomed before me, darker than the night itself, its windows like blind eyes watching. The door creaked ominously as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was frigid, each breath a cloud of vapor in the cold. The whispers started immediately, a cacophony of voices that filled the room, louder and more insistent than before. "I know what you are," I called into the darkness, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. "I know what you want, but you cannot have it." The air stirred, as if a storm were brewing within the walls. The shadows swirled, coalescing into a dense black mass near the back of the room. I could feel the malevolence pouring off it, a palpable wave of hatred and hunger. "You cannot banish what you do not understand," it hissed, the voice echoing in my mind, a sinister whisper. "I don't need to understand," I replied, pulling from my bag a small, old book I had taken from the library, the Journal of Edward Malley, filled with incantations and rituals. "I just need to stop you." I began to read aloud, the words strange and ancient, twisting my tongue. The air grew heavier, the darkness pressing in as if to smother the words in my mouth. The entity roared, a sound that shook the walls, sending dust and debris raining from the ceiling. But I kept reading, my voice growing stronger with each word. The shadows writhed, their forms becoming more distinct, more desperate. They lunged at me, but each time they came close, the words from the book repelled them, burning them like fire. The battle raged, a war of light against dark, of will against despair. I could feel the entity's strength waning, its form beginning to dissipate. But it was not yet defeated. With one final push, I read the last of the incantations, a command of banishment, strong and clear. The shadow screamed, a sound of rage and pain that echoed through the empty streets outside. Then, with a suddenness that left me reeling, it vanished. Silence fell, heavy and absolute. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, the air warming slightly around me. I waited, breath held, but the darkness did not stir again. Exhausted, I slumped to the floor, the book clutched tightly in my hands. The night outside began to wane, the first hints of dawn painting the sky with colors of hope. I had faced the darkness and survived. But as I sat there, watching the light grow, I knew the fight was not over. Whatever had haunted Brood Awakenings was part of something larger, a network of shadows and whispers that extended far beyond the walls of the coffee shop. As the sun rose, casting long shadows across the floor, I felt the weight of my next task settling over me. The darkness was waiting, and I had to be ready. I stood, my resolve firming, and walked out into the new day, leaving the now silent Brood Awakenings behind. The battle was won, but the war was just beginning. And I knew, deep in my bones, that the shadows would be watching, waiting for their next opportunity to strike. The morning sun was a welcome sight after the long, harrowing night. Its golden rays seemed to cleanse the remnants of darkness that clung to my mind. As I walked away from Brood Awakenings, the weight of what I had faced began to truly settle in. The entity, though banished, had been a mere harbinger of a deeper, more pervasive evil that lurked in the shadows of the world. Over the following days, I kept to myself, wrestling with the decision to delve deeper into this hidden world or to try and reclaim some semblance of normalcy. But the choice, it seemed, had already been made for me. Whispers in the dark corners of my room, faint and elusive at first, grew insistent. The entity I had banished was gone, but its cries had echoed in the void, calling to others. I knew I couldn't ignore it. Something had to be done, and perhaps I was the only one who could do it. Armed with Edward Malley's journal and a newfound resolve, I started my preparations. Research became my refuge, the musty pages of ancient books and the soft glow of the computer screen my constant companions. Weeks turned into months. I learned of old rituals and newer theories, blending science with the occult in ways I had never imagined. My apartment became filled with a strange assortment of items: salt from the Dead Sea, candles blessed by shamans from remote villages, mirrors crafted to reflect not just light, but also spiritual energy. Then, one night, the whispers stopped. An oppressive silence filled my apartment, thick and tangible. I knew it was time. Whatever was coming, the final confrontation was upon me. I gathered my tools, each item meticulously chosen for its specific properties, and left for Brood Awakenings. The coffee shop stood silent in the moonlight, its windows dark, the door slightly ajar as if waiting for me. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old coffee mingled with something fouler, a smell of decay and desolation. I set up my equipment in a circle around the center of the room, where the shadows had been thickest that night. Drawing a deep breath, I began the ritual. The words of the ancient incantations filled the room, vibrating against the walls. Candles flickered as if in a breeze, though the air was still. The mirrors reflected the candlelight, creating a barrier of brightness that seemed to hold the darkness at bay. Then, from the shadows, they emerged. Not just one entity, but many, each a swirling mass of darkness and malevolence. They pressed against the light, the air around them crackling with the force of their hatred. But the barrier held, the mirrors amplifying the candlelight and turning it into a weapon. The battle was long and exhausting. With each incantation, I pushed them back, confining them tighter and tighter within the circle of light. As dawn approached, their forms began to dissipate, their screams fading into whimpers. Finally, as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the last of the shadows vanished. The room grew suddenly warm, the candles burning brighter for a moment before flickering out. I sat down, the exhaustion overwhelming, but my heart was light. It was over. The days that followed were quiet. The whispers did not return, and the night was just night, dark and peaceful. I dismantled my setup at Brood Awakenings and returned the space to its mundane state. The coffee shop reopened under new management, unaware of the battles it had housed. Life, it seemed, would go on. But the world felt different to me now. I knew things I hadn't before, saw things others couldn't. The fight at Brood Awakenings had been won, but I had opened a door to something much larger than myself. There were other places, other shadows waiting in the wings. For now, though, I took comfort in the peace. I returned to my normal life, my job, my friends. But in the back of my mind, I knew I was different. I had seen behind the veil, fought the darkness and emerged victorious. And I knew, should it ever call again, I would be ready. As I sat in a new coffee shop, sipping a latte on a bright, sunny afternoon, I smiled. The world is full of darkness, but it's also full of light, and as long as there are those willing to fight, to stand against the shadows, there is hope. And so, the story of Brood Awakenings, the true coffee shop horror story, comes to a close. Not with an ending, but a beginning. A beginning of understanding, of vigilance, and of the eternal balance between light and dark.